inviting me and re-inviting me when the strike made it necessary to reschedule. I'm really, really delighted to be here. And don't worry, I do know where I am. I just forgot to change the first slide from the last time I gave this talk the other week. I managed to change the handout, so, 1 out of 2. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be sharing this work with you. Do need to start with a tiny bit of content advice. The talk will, perhaps unsurprisingly based on the title and the abstract, engage with themes about racist and sexist oppression. If I get as far as the last bit, which will be the first bit to cut if I'm, got my timer, if I'm running close to time, and there'll also be some specific examples of speech which I consider to be pretty transphobic. So I just want to make you aware of that in advance. Please do whatever you need to do to keep yourself comfortable with that material, including if anyone was to need to just take a minute, completely fine. Okay. So the starting point for this talk is a body of literature which I have for many, many years found extremely stimulating and fascinating, which is accounts of race and gender categories as the products of histories of oppression in some sense or another. I'm thinking here of things like Katharine McKinnon's account of gender as constituted by dynamics and personal dynamics of sexual subordination. This is kind of on the gender side. And people like Monique Wittig, Maria Lugones in very interesting kind of post-colonial, decolonial work, thinking about genders as constituted by or arising from subordination more generally, so not just in terms of sex, but in terms of things like labor dynamics, things like that, caring labor. And in Maria Lugones' case, a very interesting focus on kind of heteropatriarchal colonialist capitalism as the social system that produced and created gender. Gender wasn't there before. It was, other social arrangements were there, but not genders, according to Lugones. On the race side, of course, kind of first name that comes to mind here very strongly is the late great Charles Mills, who argued that races are constituted by the social imposition of either a kind of social standing of like full person with like a full suite of kind of rights and entitlements, which constitutes the racial kind white, or a sub-person status, a status depriving the person of various kind of rights and privileges, so that constituting races other than white through the racial contract. So I'm not going to go too much into detail on Mills's theory of the racial contract. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with it, but the idea being that people, that the kind of political dynamics of colonialism kind of amounted to an agreement between Europeans to treat non-Europeans as a lesser type of beings for kind of profit. More contemporary work, this work is more in, I guess, in literary theory, to the extent that we can kind of talk about these boundaries, but I found Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, extremely fascinating. She talks about continued Black subjection as an ontological negation. So you see this idea of oppression as having produced the categories. You see it with gender, you see it with race, and you also see it with people talking about both gender and race together. So it wouldn't be a talk by me if it didn't engage a lot with Sally Haslanger's work. So Haslanger's ameliorative analysis of both race and gender kinds as constituted by regularly being subordinated or privileged, as the case may be for the category in question, on the basis of observed or imagined bodily features associated either with presumed role in reproduction or with a kind of presumed ancestral links to certain parts of the world. Haslanger offers these first as an account that captures like a way that it would be good to come to use race and gender concepts, but I think in later work, and I think in the spirit of many of the people kind of taking up her work, there's the thought that this might capture kind of what is actually going on with race and gender right now, even if that's not what we sort of thought we meant by the words. So there's this body of literature which includes like many, many very exciting works, very, just stuff that I've just really enjoyed and engaging with and have found very persuasive and plausible in many ways. And there's internal differences between the people that I've kind of just mentioned, but I'm not going to kind of get into those. I want to ask a kind of a more sort of zoomed out question, which is this. So let's grant that the creation of race and gender kinds is bound up with histories of oppression in something like the way that all of the people I've just pointed at kind of think. It also seems true that many people greatly value membership in race and gender kinds, and not just in cases where that kind brings with it privilege, but in cases where that kind brings with it oppression. So somebody might value being a woman, might value being Black. That doesn't seem like a niche or a strange experience. That seems like an experience that like many people would report and that many people would find common. And in many cases, people have like reflected very carefully on that and still think, that that's the feeling that they have, right? G.K. Jeffers gives an account of race that's amenable to this, and some of Talia May Betcher's work on trans identities and experience also, I think, kind of holds to this line. So the question then is, for me, is really kind of what's going on with that, right? So how should we understand the precise ontological and normative status of race and gender kinds in the light of this sort of apparent tension, or these two kind of, I guess I'm inviting you, I'm kind of asking you here to get the talk off the ground, to kind of entertain the sort of oppression creates categories view. If I haven't motivated it a lot, if you're kind of not, if you don't think there's anything to that, then I just pretend that you do think there's something to that for the next 55 minutes, and then we can come back to it. But supposing we think there's something to that, but it also seems undeniable that people have these positive experiences of identifying with kinds, including kinds that seem like the locus of oppression. What's going on with that? What are the kinds bad? Are they good? Like, what's going on with that, both ontologically and normatively? That is something that I would like to know. So I have a recent book, and all of this work comes from that recent book, and I'm sorry I'm not presenting anything new, but the book came out this summer and I actually haven't got anything new to present because I'm tired. So, and also this is stuff that I still want to think about. I think that there's many loose ends and many things that like I want to take further or take in different directions. So sorry that it's a work that is already published. That's like, it wouldn't be my first choice to do, but given the rescheduling of this, that's what I have to offer. And it's also work that is like, it's live for me. Yeah, so that it's not, you know, it's not in the same order as it is in the book. So the points I'm going to make kind of come from the research in the book, but I'm putting them together in an order that sort of reflects my interest and my thinking much more closely than the actual chapters that ended in the book do, for reasons to do with what people tell you to do when you write books, which is put your new bit at the beginning. So what I'm going to talk about falls into 3 bits. I'm going to talk about a pluralist way of thinking about race and gender kinds, which I think is going to help us answer this question. Then I'm going to talk about race and gender and a concept that I'm calling ontic oppression. And finally, if I have time, and I really hope I get to this, I'm going to consider an objection and a response, which very much lie at the heart of what I think is interesting about this. So I'm going to do my best to get there in that spirit. Moving on. Okay, so there is a handout, I should have said. And the question that we've arrived at is at the top of the handout. The rest of some key points from the rest of the talk are on there. Everything on the handout is on the slides, but not vice versa. So it's kind of mostly there as an aid memoir. So if you find it distracting, then just don't worry about the handout. Okay. So I kind of have a lot of pluralist tendencies in the sense that like philosophers are like come up with all these interesting accounts, and I never want to have to choose between them. I always want to be like, maybe these can both be true together. So I have pluralist tendencies, and I've previously defended some more limited types of pluralism about gender. The type of pluralism about gender and race that I want to make a kind of preliminary like sketch for you and make a preliminary case for today is more thoroughgoing. So it's about race and gender kinds and not just gender. And it's kind of more ontological. So I don't just want to say there's various different concepts of gender. I want to say that the actual kinds in the world, in the vicinity of our gender talk, there's just more of them than like one kind of standout winner. And what's kind of really behind this is a desire to kind of synthesize various appealing accounts within the literature. Because if you look at the literature on gender kinds and on race kinds, especially on gender kinds, I think, actually no, that's not true, both of them. You find quite a few people being like, I'm giving this account of race, but like this other, you know, my esteemed colleague is giving this other account, and there's something to that, and maybe they can sort of both be true of different sorts of things. Moving on. And I find that really tantalizing, but kind of unsatisfying. So this is an attempt to kind of build on what I see as some sort of, in principle, friendly noises about pluralism in the literature in a more robust way. Like, how do we actually keep that straight in our heads? What does it really look like to kind of say, look, there's not one thing that's gender, or there's not one suite of categories that are the gender categories. There's several. How do we actually kind of make that work? Okay. I'm going to skip this slide. I have some background commitments. I think if they're relevant, they'll come up in the Q&A. So what I want to offer then is a framework for thinking about pluralism about race and gender kinds. So not concepts, the kind of the metaphysical kinds, explanatory kinds. And my main claim is that constraints and enablements form a kind of common denominator across quite different accounts of race and what race and gender kinds are. And if you kind of double down on the idea that constraints and enablements are kind of a common denominator, you can translate a bunch of stuff into that. And that provides a kind of intertranslatability between quite different on the surface accounts of race and gender. So looking in the kind of social ontology literature, you might think of something like John Searle's work on status functions. Alster's 2018 book, Categories We Live By, absolutely fantastic book, is one of the ones that's like most explicitly phrases this in terms of constraints and enablements. But the basic idea is that what it is to be a certain sort of social entity is to be constrained and enabled in a distinctive way. So what it is for me to be like the speaker today is partly about what I can do that you can't. So if I come to the front and start speaking after Jonathan's introduction, I get to carry on. If Ali did, then she would not get to carry on because it's not her turn today. And that's part of what it is to be the speaker in this like social setup, is the stuff you get to do. And also, you know, if I just like walked out of the room halfway through the talk, that would be much more of a problem than if one of you just walked out of the room halfway through the talk. So that's the basic idea. You can think about what it is to be a lawyer or a judge, kind of along these lines. If you're a judge and you say the sentence is this under the right circumstances, that is what the sentence is, in a way that, you know, wouldn't be true for a reporter in the courtroom, right? But that's not a new idea. That's an idea that I think pervades the social ontology literature. Not everyone endorses it, but I think it's at least a point of like some convergence. And what I want to do is I want to build on that to kind of give a framework for pluralism about social kinds by supplying two things. First, I want to give you a taxonomy of different varieties of constraints and enablements. And secondly, I want to give you a story about the kind of decisions you make to identify a social kind with a particular bundle of constraints and enablements. So if being a member of a social kind is about being constrained and enabled in characteristic ways, what is the kind of specification of what those characteristic ways are that you have to make? And I think that there are, I want to give a kind of a story about how we can do that. And the idea then is that we'll be able to translate different accounts of social kind into this framework and kind of say which varieties of constraints and enablements it includes and what kind of decisions it makes about how to specify that bundle. And then that's going to kind of work for all the different accounts. So first thing I want to try and persuade you of then is that that it makes sense. And this is a heuristic, it's not meant to be perfect, but that it would be useful, I think, to break down varieties of social constraints and enablements into 4 categories. Oh, this is not the slide I wanted it to be. There you go. Try this one, and then I'll come back to that one. Okay, so the first variety is what I call interpersonal constraints and enablements. So these are constraints and enablements directly based on the interpersonal behavior of individuals in a specific social context. So if you are in a meeting in a workplace, and every time you try and talk, at least half of the time you get interrupted by people. That's an experience that some women have in some workplaces. It's not to comment on my colleagues at Glasgow are lovely. It doesn't happen there, but it is an experience that people have. And so the constraint, like cannot finish what you're trying to say, is a constraint that's directly based on how other people are like responding to you kind of very immediately. When you do X, they do Y, right? The example of not being able to give the talk if you're not the speaker for today would fall under like interpersonal constraint. People are going to be like, oi, stop it, it's not your turn. So that is the one that I think has been most discussed by social ontologists, but I don't think that that really exhausts the kind of variety of social constraints and enablements that I think are interesting and important, especially if we're coming to this with a sort of interest in oppression. So I think another very important category of social constraints and enablements are the psychological constraints and enablements that kind of arise from our experience of social beings, the internalization of the experiences that we've had interpersonally, right? So constraints and enablements based on the ways our attitudes, dispositions, and beliefs socially shaped affect what we attempt to do. So if you spend so long in a workplace where like women are just kind of dismissed and ignored, it might feel like you just can't bring yourself to try and speak in that meeting, right? Like you might just feel like that's not an action that you can kind of psychologically bring yourself to attempt. And it might be that today everyone's not going to interrupt you, but you never find that out because you don't try, because you're subject to this psychological constraint. So I think these are very important. Sandra Buck, he writes about this. Frantz Fanon's account of psychological oppression was also kind of a big influence here. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind there. I think those need to be in the picture. The third one is bodily constraints and enablements. So constraints and enablements based on the physical properties of our bodies as shaped by social factors. So if you live in a society that like really discourages women from doing the kind of exercise that like produces like a stronger body, and then you're a woman and you like try, like there's something heavy and you can't lift it, but you could if you're a bit stronger, that not being able to lift that thing would be an example of a bodily constraint and enablement. So it's just the ones that are shaped by social factors. So the fact that I can't lift something that weighs like 1,000,000 tons is not a social constraint, because a different social context would not have like produced that capacity in me. And similarly, the last one, so I'm kind of working kind of from the inside out, I guess. The final one is environmental constraints and enablements. So constraints and enablements based on our physical environment that are shaped by social factors. So if you think of someone having like difficulty enjoying good health because the environment they're in places them very far away from like amenities, think about like a racially patterned kind of city that's kind of had the effects of redlining and various kind of planning decisions like that. You know, being far away from parks and health clinics and things might constrain your pursuit of good health. And that's obviously that's got a lot to do with your body, but it's what's preventing you from enjoying that is partly the environment. Or not being able to take up a job at a well-paying company on the other side of town because you just can't get there. There's no transport links. You can't get there and back. The environment doesn't let you do that. Or indeed, obviously, all of these are kind of focused on constraints, but also enablements in the same sense. So psychological enablement might be like feeling very entitled to speak, feeling like very comfortable taking up space, that kind of thing. I don't think all enablements are bad. That's just just one example. Okay, so my thought is that it will be good to, when people are kind of telling us a story about a social kind, it's good to have in mind these different varieties of social constraints and enablements, so we can say, okay, is the bundle that constitutes this kind, what's in that bundle? Are we just talking about interpersonal constraints, or are we talking about all four, or some other subset? What's going on? So what I want to suggest here is that the constraints and enablements that constitute a social kind, like if you are under that bundle of constraints and enablements, you're a kind member. That's what kind of grounds your kind membership is being constrained and enabled socially in a characteristic way. I think the ones, and this is quite important to me, I want to say that the ones that get to constitute the kind are the ones that actually make a difference to how people's lives play out. So they're not the ones that people think are associated with that kind in that context. So go back to the meeting, not to belabor that example, but if you had a situation where everybody in that workplace thinks that men and women are equally entitled to present their ideas at meetings, but actually in practice, when people perceived as women try and contribute, they get kind of cut off and interrupted, that would be a constraint in the picture, on my view, because it's not about what people think you're entitled to do, like in theory, it's like what actually happens. Well, I want to basically look at like the pattern of incidents that actually happens and kind of extrapolate a story about what the constraints and enablements are based on that. So it's a nice, but there's like a quote I find quite powerful from Saidiya Hartman here. She says, Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. So this, I think, belongs in that quite pessimistic group of theorists that I was talking about at the beginning. But I think what she's talking about here is this idea that like the pattern that plays out is what we should be kind of reading off of, and not kind of, some kind of theoretical postulate that like people are equal now. And I'm sympathetic to that. So basically, the thought is that if you're looking to kind of find kinds that can sort of play explanatory roles for you, kind of be used in projects of like prediction and inference and explanation and intervention, you're looking for kind of people who share constraints and enablements in such a way that that grouping is like useful in those ways. I want to suggest that, and I've given you this kind of taxonomy of the different constraints and enablements that are the social ones. I think that the next step is to kind of say, okay, how do we get from like the pattern of incidents to the kinds? Like, how do we get from like a bunch of stuff happening to a cluster of constraints and enablements where we're saying like, yeah, this is the, if you fall in this, then you're a member of that kind. And I want to suggest that we can do it. And again, this is like a heuristic, a bit of a simplification. I'm really, really interested to know how this sort of strikes people who do more kind of modeling work and more kind of empirical work, as I know many of you will. I really would like to know how this strikes you. But the suggestion is that we basically face like 3 decisions. We like specify 3 kind of variables, and that kind of points us towards that gets us to that cluster specified. I'm actually going to do the next slide before this one. So the thought is it's a bit like sliders on a sound mixing board. Like if you set them at, you have multiple different sliders, but say there's just 3, right? And if you set them at a particular combination of settings, you get a particular sound output. That's kind of how I'm thinking about these 3 variables. So the first variable is I'm calling scope. which is basically what context are we focusing on? So are we trying to work out what it is to be a woman, or let's say what it is to be a white woman, like in this seminar room here today in the LSE in London? Are we trying to work out what it is to be a white woman in London in 2023? We're trying to work out what it is to be a white woman in the UK in the 2020s. You see what I mean? There's like a time and a place that we're like asking this question, and we're looking at the constraints enablement. That's kind of like a viewfinder for like where and when are we looking at the stuff that's happening. The second one, I really struggled to come up with a good name for this that was different from scope, but I'm calling it breadth, which is which varieties of constraints enablements are we looking at? Are we just looking at the interpersonal ones? Are we just looking at the psychological ones? We're looking at all four and their complex interactions, like what's in the picture? Because some social ontologists, I think, want to tell a story that's really just picking up on some of those constraints and enablements. And I think that's fine, but we should be like conscious that we could be like explicit about the choice to kind of narrow it down or keep it broader in that sense. Finally, I'm not going to say loads about this today. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I think there's a question about what I'm calling granularity, which is about what level of detail we should understand the constraints and enablements, like how detailed should we be when we say like this is what you can or can't do. And I think this matters a lot for theorizing intersectionality. So let me give you kind of a quick example, but I am happy to say more about this in the Q&A. So imagine, like, take you back to that annoying work meeting again. Imagine there's a white woman there, and every time she tries to speak, like it's 50-50 whether she'll finish what she's trying to say. Imagine her colleague is an Asian woman, and she gets interrupted like 90% of the time that she tries to talk. On what level of generality we can say that they share a constraint? They're both under this constraint that they're less able to be allowed to get their points across, to finish what they're saying. But obviously, if we're going more fine-grained, we can also like have a more fine-grained specification that captures that important difference, right? So basically, my view, in a sort of short version, is that granularity is kind of how we deal with intersectionality. If we specify constraints and enablements in a more fine-grained way, we get more kind of intricately intersectional kinds, like disabled Black woman, or straight white woman, or bisexual white woman. And if we are content with a more granular, kind of more zoomed out, kind of less detailed specification of the constraints, you get more to kind of what I call single moniker categories, so like woman or Black. And I think that that's a useful thing to be able to do. Okay, so mixing board, right. If that all sounded a bit schematic, then fair enough. What I want to do now is take you through a couple of existing accounts of race and gender kind in the literature and try and make the case that they can all be kind of fitted into this framework using the tools I've just given you, which hopefully will illustrate the tools and make them make a bit more sense. Okay. Let's start with Haslanger's account, which I'm going to call an account of hegemonic race and gender kinds. That's the kind of name I've given it to distinguish it from some other ones. So what I think Haslanger's account really captures is like being a person of a particular race and or gender in the sense of occupying a certain position in a pretty large scale social structure. So I think that gives us a very wide scope. So she's not interested in like this seminar room here today. She's interested in like something much, much broader, something like late 20th century and early 21st century, maybe Western society or just the world. I'm not totally clear, but it's a very wide scope. And I think it's a very broad focus. This talk of like subordinated in or privileged in some respect, I think invites us to think in terms of the whole spectrum of different social constraints and enablements, like environmental and bodily, as well as interpersonal and psychological. And seeing all the interactions, right? And I think it's very coarse-grained. So she's specifying this constraints and enablements in quite a low level of detail. And that means we can say, the women are like the people who are subordinated in some way or another. Because if we got more specific about the modes of subordination, we would start to arrive instead at more finely intersectional categories. I think these are really, really useful kinds to be able to talk about. I think they have a lot of explanatory value. So I think they're useful because they pick up on far-reaching social structures. And I think that oppression, like if we're interested in, if my explanatory aim in this project is a kind of feminist and anti-racist explanatory aim, I want to understand these kinds as part of a project of helping to dismantle oppression. well, oppression is this like systemic or structural phenomenon. We're trying to end it everywhere. So these kinds that pick up on like a broad, they're very broadly applicable, and also they're really capturing like the interaction of these different varieties of kinds. That's, you know, that's a lot of how social structures hang together. So I think that's really useful. I have like a tiny quibble, which is that I think that it's probably more useful to go slightly more intersectional than the Hasliner's account kind of as it currently exists, but I don't think that's a big point of disagreement between us. I'm just, I guess I'm quite convinced by Maria Lugones's view that race and gender are very deeply kind of imbricated with each other in kind of social practices due to the way that sort of heteropatriarchal capitalist colonialism has worked. I'm sympathetic to that, but that's a very minor quibble. So I think these are very useful kinds to be able to talk about if you're interested in emancipation. I now want to move to like a very contrasting variety of race and gender kinds that is also kind of existing in the literature. And this is something like a social role assigned in a specific context. The inspiration here is Auster's account of race and gender kinds as radically context-dependent, interpersonally conferred kinds. Which basically means that like your attitudes to me in this room makes it the case that I'm a woman in this room, in the same way as somebody might think that the God's love confers the property of piety upon an action. So it's the attitudes of others that like give us a social status, and then having that status is what it is to be a woman, to be Black, to be a police officer. Like she thinks this works for all sorts of different social kinds, religion among them, for example. So Auster's kind of at the opposite end of a spectrum from Sally, I think, in terms of scope. So she is interested in this granular thing of how, you know, she has this example where like you're at work and you're one of the guys, and then you go to a bar and it's really heteronormative, and like you're not a guy or a gal, you're like a weird other, and then you go to like a different bar on the same street, and here you're a butch and you need to buy drinks for the femmes, and like that's what your gender is here, and then you go like home to like a party and like a family party, and you're a woman and you're going to help out in the kitchen while the men smoke cigars. So she kind of talks about how in the course of a single day you move through these different like spaces and you have a different gender in them because people are treating you differently in them. And so that's a very narrow scope. It's like a totally other end of the slider on that one. It's also a very narrow focus. She's not looking at like the internal psychological kind of constraints, enablements that you're bringing to situations. She's just looking at how other people treat us very immediately. She's not looking at the kind of congealed effects of that on our bodies or our environments, like directly at least, I don't think. So it's very narrow scope, very narrow focus. She does it in a way that's quite coarse-grained, but I think you can very easily adjust it to be more fine-grained. I've written about that elsewhere. Okay, so why are these kinds useful to be able to talk about? So that the group of people who are unified by particular like shared pattern of interpersonal constraints enablement in a very specific context. Why is that useful, a useful grouping to be able to like use in your theorizing and in your practical interventions? Well, I think that they explain a lot about the localized dynamics of oppression, and I think that matters a lot because I think that emancipation requires people understanding that the texture of our own lives differently. Like if we just think about oppression as this kind of very abstract thing that's quite far away from like what our lives are like day to day, I think it's very difficult to kind of get people on board with anti-oppressive projects. I think we need to kind of see the impacts of those structures in the immediacy of our lives. I don't really see any kind of way around that. And these kinds capture like those sorts of commonalities, and I think that's really useful. Okay, so we don't experience the world all in one go, we experience it in a much more piecemeal way. So to understand what it is to count as an Asian woman, for example, in a particular context, might be a crucial route to a much more broad insight about race and gender oppression, and I think that's largely what we see happening. And I think you see this a bit with consciousness raising. So I don't think one of these kinds is like more useful than the other, I just think they do different explanatory work for us. Let's talk about time. Yes, I will talk briefly about a third variety of kinds, which is I call race and gender identity kinds. This is roughly how people experience themselves in relation to kind of social norms and practices of race and gender in their particular context. Maybe not like a super tight context, like a broader context. So I've written about gender identity in the past as being a felt relationship to the social norms concerning gender in one's context. So me feeling like when they say women should shave their legs, they mean me, and my legs being shaved or not shaved will have a social meaning as like transgressive or or like compliant relative to that expectation. Not that I necessarily feel like I have to do that, but that's what's the kind of reference point for the meaning of that behavior. They mean me when they say that women should do that. Whether I do it or not, different question. So I think that this has a much wider scope. It follows a person through many different contexts, but it's kind of in between the other two. It's kind of a medium one. I do think that like if you change countries or you look at really different times, then you're probably going to end up saying that people should have kind of quite different gender identities. I think that's probably how that would fall. And I think this is a really narrow focus, but in a different way, because here we're only looking at the psychological constraints enablement. The whole point of gender identity as a concept, one reason I think it's useful, is that someone can have a gender identity that's at odds with how they're being treated by other people around them in a particular moment. For me, it's about the psychological constraints and enablements, not the like directly interpersonal ones. And I think it's quite coarse-grained the way I have stated it, but a pattern here, I think that a more granular approach is probably better. Okay, why are these kinds useful? Well, I think they're useful for quite similar reasons to interpersonal kinds. I think they also help us to understand the kind of micro texture of oppression as we live it, but just from a different angle or in a different way. So I think understanding like why we experience a situation like we do, it can be really useful to understand like the role that our self-conception as white or as a woman or as whatever is playing, is like feeding into that situation. I also think that they're really, really, really important for change, for like emancipatory social change, because I don't think it's possible to bring about a kind of large-scale kind of structural emancipatory change without kind of inviting people and having people come to relate to their sense of self in a different way. If people are very invested in like being women and being men, and like that is a sense of identity that they're like very, very attached to, if you wanted to kind of invite them to envision a society that was like much less gendered, there would be resistance there, or people would have to find like a new way. Or if they think of like being a man means being an economic provider to a non-working like partner who like does a lot of childcare or whatever, and that's what it is to be a man, if you want to change those practices, you're going to have to invite that person to like maybe not think of themselves as a man, maybe think of themselves as being a man in a way that's like constituted by something different. And I think we see this, in fact, in all sorts of kind of actual kind of social movements, right? We're not going to get anywhere unless we actually invite people to change the way they relate to their structure. And I find Robin Jung's work on social roles and structural injustice really, really useful here. And the idea that like one of the ways that we actually shift the social structures we're part of is by inhabiting our roles within them in a different way. So if we want the university to work in a different way, we want to come with them, maybe we need to model being a lecturer or whatever in a different way. We need to like treat doing diversity and inclusion work as part of what it is to be a lecturer, even if the institution's not telling us that's part of what it is to be a lecturer, because that's how we like bring about a shift in explanation. That was a kind of on the cuff, on the fly example, but I hope it makes sense. I really like this paper by Jean. And I think it's also quite useful, and this will come back in the final bit of the talk, it's quite useful for countering the oppression of groups whose identities are often undermined. So for example, if you want to understand the nature of like misgendering of trans people, or misgendering of anybody, I guess, but misgendering of trans people in particular, what like its associated harms, I think it's useful to be able to appeal to these identity-based kinds. Okay. So that's kind of hopefully given a little bit of an illustration of what's going on with this like framework. Those are quite different on the face of it accounts of gender and time. But what I'm arguing is that they all kind of can be understood in terms of constraints and enablements. And that the constraints and enablements framework gives us like a way of getting a handle on that systematically. So it's not kind of a sort of mishy-mashy free-for-all. The other point that I want to make here, I guess, is that I don't think that there is a sort of straightforward winner between those three accounts, or indeed any other accounts you might want to put on the table in terms of explanatory value. And I think that's even true if you specify that your explanatory purposes are sort of broadly emancipatory ones. I just think they all do useful work, and they do different work, and we need to be able to kind of have them all in our toolkits. So I don't think there's a kind of winner in terms of explanatory value. And given some background stuff, I think that that means that we should say that they're all real kinds. We should say that they all kind of win a place in our ontology, in our story about what's in the world. A quick note, I think that draw is on an ontological level. I don't think, for example, that this by itself settles any questions about the reference of like gender and race terms. So I really want to be explicit that I'm not saying that what I've done so far, like tell that the term woman is ambiguous between these three kinds, or tells us anything at all about the term woman. I'm trying to talk about like the kinds in the world that are in the vicinity of our talk and practices and like theorizing around these things. That's a bit tricky to do. And so I think that, like, it's easy for that not to come across. So I want to be really explicit. I don't think that this is an account of gender and race concepts or of terms. It's an account of kinds. And there's just more work to be done figuring out what we say about concepts and terms. And I'm not a philosopher of language, and I also don't really know what I think concepts are, so I'm probably not going to do that work. Someone else should. Okay, let's do that. Right. Okay. So in the next 20 minutes, I want to give you some of the normative, kind of like, given that on like metaphysical situation, I want to say some stuff about like the normative aspect of the question that I started with, like what do we say about these kinds that seem to be like produced from oppression, but people are also kind of invested in them. And then if I have time, I'll do this objection and response, which I hope I will. So all the kinds I've talked about so far can be seen as arising from oppressive social structures and histories that we already knew, if you accept the posit that I began with. But what we now have is much more detail on what constitutes kind membership in each case. In each case, being a woman, being a white woman, being Black, whatever, is about being like under a particular set of constraints and enablements shared with the other members of that kind in the relevant context. And we can kind of use the different varieties of kinds that we have to kind of say what those constraints and enablements are in each case. Now I'm in a position to consider the normative status of these kinds. So what I want to do here is use a concept that I've introduced in earlier work, and also it's kind of in the first chapter of the book, which is basically captures what I think is like not news, but I think it captures it in a slightly more precise way. So the idea I want to capture with the concept of ontic injustice is that the constraints and enablements that constitute a social kind, so that falling under them grounds your kind membership, they can be morally bad. They can fall short of what a person is owed, morally speaking. So a very kind of, so in that case, social kinds are such that the individuals who are constructed as members of those kinds can be wronged by the very fact of being socially constructed in that way. And that wrong that is constituted by, it's like wrongful social construction, basically. I want to call that ontic injustice. So very sort of striking and pronounced example would be the kind slave in Jamaica in 1800. So an individual's being constructed as a slave, if you think like what are the characteristic constraints and enablements, they're very, very bad, extremely unjust social constraints. What I want to say is that the very fact of being made into a member of that social kind is unjust, regardless of whatever specific social experience like actually follows. So I don't think we need to know like exactly what happened to somebody who was like made into a slave in Jamaica in 1800 to know that something very wrongful happened to them. Probably all sorts of like material harms did then before them, and those are like wrongs in and of themselves. But what I want to say is that even upstream of them, there is the wrong that's the very fact of being made into that sort of social being. So it's not the consequences, it's not like the psychological harm, it's the very fact of being constructed that way. I theorize this wrong in terms of a mismatch. So I want to say that the social constraints and enablements that constitute the kind, we take them and we compare them to the moral entitlements of the individual that was constructed as a kind member, and what we see is a discrepancy. So you're entitled to enjoy the fruits of your own labors, but you're on a moral level, but you're not entitled on a social level because you've been made into a slave, right? Something even worse than that, perhaps. So it's a mismatch. And the way I want to think about the kind of wrongfulness of this mismatch is I want to say that it's a kind of moral injury, borrowing from Jean Hampton. So I want to say it's something like an affront to value or dignity, where the victim's value or the acknowledgement of their value is damaged through behavior that conveys meaning. So I want to say it's like a harm to, like an affront to the value or dignity of a being, of somebody, when they're constructed as a type of social being that doesn't have the moral kind of standing or entitlements that they, you know, in fact ought to have, given the kind of being they actually are. Some people don't, like, I've come to the conclusion that this is a kind of concept that you're either kind of like, oh yeah, that seems all right, or you're like, what is this? So I think it's quite similar to things like dignitary harm and like failures of recognition, respect. But I think, like, from presenting this and talking to people, I think some people are just like, yeah, I just don't know what those are really meant to be, though. And I don't have a lot to say to those people. I think it's one of those things that you're either like, yeah, I see a room for that in my moral toolkit, or you're like, no, I don't see a room for it. So if you don't see room for it, we can still be friends. I think that what I would want to say is that you can do it with risk instead. I find that less like, that resonates less with me, but you can see it as risk. So ontic injustice places individuals at an unfair risk of harm. So if somebody cuts the seatbelt in my car so that were I to crash the car, I would like be badly injured, and I never crashed the car, I think I've still been wronged because I was placed at like a higher risk by them, and that was like not okay. So if you don't like this, you can do it in terms of this. Okay. So there's some kind of definition-y stuff, but I'm going to move on. I like this concept. I spent a really long time trying to come up with it. I think it's useful, but I think it has some like problems when you try and apply it under conditions of oppression because of the effects of naturalizing ideology. So I think that ideology distorts our ability to discern what the moral entitlements of particular kinds of beings are. So I'll give you an example. If you think that university education is bad for women because it will wither their ovaries and lead to a range of health problems and prevent them from flourishing, it's not wrongful to deny university education to women. Obviously, it is wrongful to deny university education to women, but the whole point of naturalizing ideology is that it makes certain things seem fitting for that group of people because of what we like know they're like, right? So you might think that under those conditions, going around looking for mismatch is like a bad method to identify ontic injustice. So the very wrong we're trying to identify might compromise the judgments we make. So I came up with a kind of more specific type of ontic injustice, which I call ontic oppression. So in ontic injustice, the constraints and enablements are just like generally wrongful in some way. In cases of ontic oppression, the constraints and enablements are like systematically oppressive. They reach a certain level of like systematic like interlockingness, and they include various kind of characteristic bad things. This is drawing very strongly on Iris Marion Young's definition of oppression. So what I want to say is that an individual suffers ontic oppression if and only if they're socially constructed as a member of a certain social kind, where that construction consists, at least in part, of their being subjected to a set of social constraints and enablements that are systematically interrelated and that steer them towards social positions characterized by suffering at least one of the following: exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, violence. Those are all from Iris Marion Young, and communicative curtailment is one that I added because I felt like it belonged in there, like things like being silenced or illocutionary disablement and testimonial injustice, things like that. So you less voice, less ability to kind of speak and be heard. Lack of platforms and access to media outlets would be one example. So the thought is, this is a story about some stuff that whenever you see it happening to a human being, you're like, that's bad. This is not a silver bullet. It still requires judgment to say, like, is this exploitation or is it not? Like, I don't know, my nephew just got his first job and he's 16 and he's being paid a pittance, but like the minimum wage for people in that age bracket is like less than, you know, than for people who are older. And so like, I think that's exploitation, but people might disagree. So these are not like straightforward things that we don't have. I'm not saying that we don't have to do any interpretation to decide if this applies. I'm just saying that we're like looking for some phenomenon that we've kind of got a handle on as being bad whenever they happen. And when we see them happening, we don't have to be like, oh, is that okay for those people though? Because maybe it is. We're just like, oh yeah, you know, marginalization, yeah, that's not okay. Whoever it's happening to, it's not okay. So I think ontic oppression is like maybe more useful for some kinds of inquiries because it's a little bit less susceptible to naturalizing ideology. So what I want to do now is I want to look at the different varieties of race and gender kinds I talked about, and I want to ask the question, in each case, is it ontically oppressive? So given the constraints and enablements that constitute the kind, is oppression kind of got in there among those, right? And I'm going to say that, you know, we should be kind of troubled and worried by the ones where it has, and less, you know, not so troubled and worried similarly by the ones where it hasn't. So with hegemonic kinds, I think it's pretty straightforward. These are the Haslanger style kinds, the very structural ones. I think all of the non-dominant kinds, all the kinds like woman or various like non-white categories, right? Non-binary genders would also fall under here. They're ontically oppressive. What it is, like the constraints and enablements that constitute kind membership are problematic in this way just outlined. Haslanger talks about being systematically subordinated, right? Like that's the step from there to oppression is like that. That's very obvious. With interpersonal kinds, I think it's way more complicated because it depends where, right? So Auster's story about interpersonal, what I'm calling interpersonal kinds, she calls conferred kinds, it just depends what room you're in. Like, is being a woman constituted by like constraints, enablements that involve like marginalization and like less ability to speak and stuff? Well, it depends where. Some spaces, yes, other spaces, no. Think about being a woman in a feminist like meeting or being Black in a Black community space. Actually, in those spaces, the kind of like non-dominant identity might be actually constituted by like more voice or like more status to like have opinions about something or like being more centered and included. So if you have a space that like centers women's voices, then the enablement of being like more easily able to be heard compared to someone who's not a woman might be active in that space and might be part of what it is to be a woman in that space if we're accepting that constraints and enablements constitute kind membership. So, and I think something similar about identity kinds, but I'm not going to get into that now. So some race and gender kinds, so what I'm wanting to say here is that race and gender are not like one thing each. Like there's not like one thing that it is to be a woman, one kind that we're saying I'm a member of when we say Katharine is a woman. There's many social kinds that are gender. Gender is many things. So is race, and then you have the intersections of them, and that's important and complex. And some of those kinds are ontologically oppressive, but others are not. And some are actively emancipatory. Some might actively play a role in facilitating like emancipatory like resistance and social change. So we cannot say, so even if we're taking it for granted that we wouldn't have race and gender kinds on our hands if we hadn't had these histories of oppression, once we look in detail at the different constraints and enablements that constitute like this different kind of spread of kinds, we can't just say race is ontologically oppressive or like gender is ontologically oppressive. Even if we specify that we're talking about the non-dominant kinds, it depends. So people are indeed, I think, wronged or oppressed by how they're constituted as members of race and gender kinds. And I want to make this very intimate connection between the construction and the wrong, but not in all cases. This is not the whole story. So I think, if you buy that, then what you can say is that when people value membership in race and gender kinds, we can plausibly take them as like a charitable and like reasonable reading to take them to be valuing membership in the harmless or emancipatory kinds. Some of the time, right? I don't think that all of our investment in racial and gendered identities is like completely should be exempted from all forms of scrutiny. I just wanted to rule out this idea that we would like immediately give somebody a funny look if they were like, yeah, I value being a woman. I'm glad I'm a woman, right? Or glad that I'm Black or Asian or whatever it might be. Okay, so that answers the question that I set out to answer. I have, like about 5 minutes?
About 5 minutes would be great.
Great, okay. And then I will briefly try and sketch an objection and a response because it's something that I thought about a lot while I was writing this, and it kind of speaks to the motivation for it in the first place. And then I'm looking forward to the questions. So here's a worry that some people definitely are going to have about what I've just said. So you might object to my pluralist account of gender because it entails that people can be members of hegemonic and interpersonal gender kinds that do not match their gender identity. On my view, when society treats you as a woman, either on a big scale or in like a localized space, you become a member of the kind woman, even if that's not the kind you identify with. So imagine a case where an agender person, Ollie, is consistently perceived and treated as a woman in their workplace despite having communicated to their colleagues their agender. Maybe they prefer they them pronouns and their colleagues continue to use like she, her, that kind of thing. So according to my account, in misgendering, Ollie is a member of the interpersonal gender kind woman in their workplace, even though they are also a member of the gender identity kind agender. That's just like, remember I said like it's how stuff plays out that determines like what the kinds are? That's how stuff is playing out. That's very bad and unfair, but that is how it's playing out. So that's like, this is the situation that we are left with in terms of ontology. So the worry is, and I think a non-trivial number of people definitely have this worry, is that this is a normatively unacceptable consequence. It's kind of siding with oppressive ideology to say that Ollie is a member of the interpersonal gender kind woman in their workplace. And so my pluralist account should be rejected. Maybe we need like a non-pluralist account that like puts everything on gender identity. Maybe we just need some kind of deflationary account. We need to do something different. Like this won't wash. So I take this very, very seriously. I'm like, I don't agree with the objection. I don't think the objection works, but I take it really seriously. I think it's a very important objection to think about in the current political climate. So let me first get clear about what I think my account actually says. So obviously, Ollie suffers ontic oppression, I think, in virtue of being made into a member of the interpersonal kind woman. If that includes like, must have she, her pronouns used for you, and Ollie like needs people to use they, them pronouns to feel comfortable, then like there's a morally important need that Ollie has that is not met when they're put in that interpersonal kind woman. I think that's oppressive. I think that's a case of ontic oppression. Drawing here on Stephanie Kabusta's work on misgendering. So it's not that we're always obliged to treat people exactly in line with how they identify, but I think in the case of gender, there are morally important needs that people have that arise in their gender identity, and when you misgender them, you block the meeting of those needs. I think that they are thereby harmed and wronged, and are harmed and wronged in a way that contributes to things like marginalization and violence, cultural imperialism. So I think that that's oppressive. So my account does not license treating Ollie as a woman. So when social kinds are problematic, when they're ontically unjust, and very much in agreement with Robin Denbrough here, we have really good reason, I think, often to arrange our social practices to not track and reflect them. So I'm not saying like, roll on Ollie's colleagues, that's fine, carry on misgendering Ollie because you are correct that they are a member of the interpersonal kind woman. I think that's not, like, extremely not okay, and I don't think anything I've said commits me to thinking that that's okay. And also, I'll just remind you that this isn't meant to be an account of gender terms. I'm talking about the kinds. The terms is a further question. So it's compatible with saying that it would even be false to say Ollie is a woman. It gives you resources to make the case that it's not false, but you could say that that's false, even like given the ontological story I've told. It's just a story about ontology. I haven't committed to a view about terms. But I think this is not going to move people. There are some people, I think, who are just going to be like, yes, it's still bad, it's still worrying, especially in the current climate. Like, you haven't, like, I understand what you're saying, but I still don't like it. And some people might think it's politically urgent to vindicate trans people's claims, all claims by trans people about their genders on a metaphysical level, to say, yeah, the ontology of gender is such that if Ollie says, I'm a non-binary person, like, based on the metaphysics, they can only be correct. Like, there's no like room for supporting any other view. So that person and I just disagree very deeply, because I think that's when social kinds are produced by social practices. And when social practices are really messed up, the kinds you get out can be really messed up as well. And I think that this objection is basically amounting to being like, no, we have to have a theory that makes the kinds come out good. And just like, there's just a big methodological disagreement here. But I also think there's something more I can say about this. So we've kind of quickly here, I take the, we can come back to that if you're curious. I think there is a very politically urgent context where we're seeing very systematic assaults on the rights of trans people as part of a global anti-LGBT, anti-feminist project, what Elizabeth Corridor calls a kind of anti-gender moment. In that context, I appreciate that like thinking about the sort of dialectics of how we push back against that is very important, and that we should be worried about giving ammunition to problematic views by like our philosophizing is not taking place in this like hermetically sealed seminar room. Like, we do need to think about that. But I in fact think that the view I'm presenting offers better routes to resisting that than what is often happening. Because what is often happening is that people are trying to kind of progress trans liberation by way of appealing to what gender really is. So think of slogans like trans women are women. So people make a metaphysical claim in order to push back against certain kind of forms of like political campaigning that would deprive trans people of like needed rights. I just don't think that's a very good strategy. I don't think it has been effective, and I think it has really major drawbacks. The main reason I think this is because I think that questions about the nature of gender, I guess I would say this because otherwise I'd be out of a job, but I do think that questions about the nature of gender are really complicated. They are riddled with competing considerations. They're quite difficult to settle. I think if the question is, well, we need to figure out what gender is before we know what to do about this like policy proposal or this legislative thing, I think that's bad news, because it's going to take us a while, and like these needs are urgent and these like political demands are urgent, and they shouldn't be hostage to us being like, oh, okay, let's read some Beauvoir, let's think about it. I think that's really unhelpful. I also don't think that those questions resolve the way that my critic, the person who, you know, like me is concerned to advance the trans liberation kind of social movement, but is worried that what I'm doing is going to be unhelpful for that. I think they need these questions to resolve in ways I don't think these questions resolve. So I think they needed to come out that gender identity like is the real truth of what gender is. And I just don't think gender identity does all the explanatory work we've asked gender to do. I think pretending that it does gives ammunition to people who want to say that there's some kind of conflict of interest between the rights and interests of cis women and the rights and interests of trans people, which I think is false. But I think this like fuels that position. So a better thing to say when people are like, you know, we should be in touch with reality. We know the real truth about sex and gender or whatever, and it's trans-exclusionary. I think a better thing to say is like, who cares? Like, why do we kind of track the reality of social categories when those categories are really problematic? Like, we don't need to figure out who really is what and then treat people as the thing that they are. We need to figure out what arrangements are going to support people to live with like dignity and safety, and then we need to do that. And that's not a metaphysical question, it's like a practical and a normative, like a moral question. So I think it's much more helpful to frame questions about gender recognition and trans rights as practical and normative instead of as metaphysical. Instead of focusing on like who really is a woman, we should be asking questions like what will be the effects of adopting one or another practice of like gender recognition legislation, for example, and which effects like of the available options best help everyone to live with safety and dignity. I've got time to go into this. I think when we ask those questions, we don't end up with like complicated trade-offs and lots of tensions and like difficult things that require us all to be like, oh my gosh, it's so complicated, let's press pause on social reform and like really like think about this. I think it's actually really straightforward. So I take seriously the worry that it will be a problem if what I'm saying had politically regressive connotations, let's say, in the current context. I accept that that would be a genuine problem. I don't want to be like, oh, I'm doing the philosophy, so who cares? But I actually do think that this is more dialectically helpful in the current moment. So Natalie Wynn, the video essayist, says something similar. She says that the trans debate wrongly gets framed as an intellectual conflict about the metaphysics of gender, when really it is a political conflict about the social equality of transgender people, and I'm really sympathetic to that. So basically what I want to say to the critic is that de-emphasizing metaphysical disputes about gender does not hinder efforts to advance trans liberation, although I see why you might worry that it would. I think, in fact, it helps them. And partly that's because, as social ontologists, we should seek to understand how oppressive social realities work while resisting the temptation to kind of read the liberation that we want to see into the way the social world currently exists. So our work does not stop at describing the current state of social reality, but extends to envisioning ways in which it might be refashioned in the interest of emancipation. And that's my talk.